Record. And welcome everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to the March 2021 edition of the Transceiver Speaker Series, Hidden Features, Designing for Democratic Equality Among Future Spacefarers. This talk is brought to you by the New School Policy and Design for Outer Space in SPDOS and the Liberal Studies program at the New School for Social Research. And before we get started and I introduce our guest speaker tonight, just a few housekeeping items. Colin, there we go, thank you. So first and foremost, this event is being recorded. So, and will be made available on our YouTube channel at a later date. So if you, for whatever reason, are not comfortable being recorded, please feel free to keep your camera off. And you should feel free to use the chat in Zoom for general conversation. We will have a moderated Q&A after the talk. However, we've been talking with David, and there's going to be a more engaged back and forth during the conversation after David says a few words. So please, feel free to hop in. It's going to be a very light touch moderation period after the initial presentation. And finally, if you have any questions but don't want to ask them yourself for whatever reason, please feel free to type it in the chat preceded with Q. That way that our moderator can identify that question and can raise it for you in your stead. So that's it for housekeeping. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to message me directly in the chat. We'll be happy to get back to you. And now to introduce our guest speaker for tonight, we are thrilled to welcome David Colby Reed, who is a designer, educator, and technologist. He's a co-founder of FUSA and the Space Governance Collaboration based at MIT. He's worked on a number of different projects, and he's a past fellow at Harvard and MIT's Assembly program, as well as serving on boards of various organizations. He's also a lecturer on leave from the Parsons School of Design. Welcome home. And David has degrees from Harvard, including a public policy degree from NYU, and is currently pursuing a PhD at the MIT Media Lab. And at the Media Lab, he also is a member of the Space Enabled Research Group, which brings us here tonight. He's going to speak about some of his work there. So please, everyone, warm round of applause for David Colby Reed. Thank you so much for joining us, David.
Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about, share some thoughts in progress about some of these questions, these like speculative questions about space futures. And also, I see there are a few of my family members on, so I get to explain what I have been thinking about lately. So thank you for that, Transceiver series. So I'm going to, let's see, once I figure out how to get the screens going, I'm going to get started. Okay, brilliant. So thanks for the opportunity to speak with you this evening. As Nick was saying, I'm at the MIT Media Lab in the Space Enabled Research Group, and I want to talk about some more speculative stuff, like particularly democratic equality in future spacefaring society. And hopefully what we can do with this conversation is, I'll talk for a while, probably too long, and but I want to offer a couple of frames, and then so that we have a common basis for a discussion, and then we can open it up for just more wide-ranging Q&A and discussion as well. So I want to ask with this talk, are democratic social relations possible in outer space? And before I get to that,
David, sorry.
Yes.
Quick question. Are you sharing your screen right now?
Oh, I thought I was, but I was not. I'm sorry. It's not my first time doing this, and yet. So as I do this, do you see the full screen version, or are you seeing my notes?
We see the full screen version.
Okay, perfect. All right, so Nick was just giving me giving an overview of some of my background. In pertinent part, I want to call out background in psychology, in public administration and public policy, and design. And I'm trying to like weave these things together in my program at the Media Lab, where I'm studying with my advisor is Danielle Wood, who does system architecture and thinking about how you organize complex socio-technical systems. And my part of that is I'm thinking about how to build equity into the architectures of these systems. Hopefully what I mean by that will become clearer as we go on, but I just first a quick note on my research group where I'm spending my time these days. Space Enabled is a group at the Media Lab whose mission is to advance justice in Earth's complex systems using designs enabled by space. It's a bit of a mouthful, and we cover a bit of breadth with our subject matter. So we take a broad view of sustainability in this group. Projects range from managing debris pollution of low Earth orbit to greener and less expensive propellants for small satellites, which that in itself can allow for different types of missions and for different types of numbers as well, to projects that use remote sensing and other space-enabled capabilities to support sustainable development on Earth. So, as I was mentioning earlier, what I want to do tonight is share some thoughts and progress on more speculative questions for the prospects of democratic social relations and governance in space. And to do so, I'm going to analogize from a few past and contemporary contexts, because I think it anchors some of the speculation. So here's a version of the big question for tonight. This is like the cocktail party version of one of my big questions. But how do you quit your job when you work in space? Just think about it. You can't walk out, not unless you want to die. And so like what obligations do we have to each other if we aspire to adjust society in space? How can we avoid or navigate the asymmetries of like authority and standing, esteem that translate into social hierarchy in the space context? And what might be a basis for making claims on one another in future spacefaring societies? I want to approach some of these questions with a bit of a framework, but first an analogy and some background. The idea here is that we'll have some shared frames of reference for this discussion by talking about past technology and how that has influenced the course of human affairs. And so I want to talk about the automobile and the automotive era, a very 20th century technology as we start at the beginning of the 21st, right? So how might we have considered private automobile ownership at the start of the 20th century, knowing what we know now? What do we know now? Forgive me as I read the slide to you for a sec, but technologies have the potential to alter the pulse of daily life beyond recognition. This excerpt comes from a book by Samuel Schwartz on driverless cars, but he's trying to project and imagine what it might have been like, at the dawn of the automotive era. So he writes, as I travel back in my mind to Simon Morley's New York City of the 1880s, I imagine myself talking to a pedestrian and explaining to him that within 20 years, we would shine a light in his face and he would stop. He would hug buildings while he walked, and that he'd only cross at corners where the government said it was okay to proceed. If he failed to comply, he'd be charged with a criminal violation and be subject to arrest. The pedestrian from the 1880s would laugh at me and say that no sane society would allow that to happen. It was inconceivable. This is, of course, our present, but it would have sounded like some fanciful science fiction of the time. Image credit is Disney, please don't come after me. It's fair use. So what else do we know now? From an essay in the New Yorker, Nathan Heller writes, sane, upstanding pedestrians didn't murder one another as they ran errands around town. Sane, upstanding drivers did, or might at any moment, and thus required a new form of policing. How could a democratic society founded on self-governance depend on police governance and still be free? Sarah Seo, a law professor at the University of Iowa, has treated this in a really interesting book, but her idea is that the problem of policing cars, far from being a remote corner of the law, is central to how the jurisprudence of the Fourth Amendment took shape during the past 100 years. Um, so a car is a bit of private property, it's a 2-ton, murder machine, like operating on public roads, impacting public safety. So how do you think about the boundaries between personal and private space? A statistic from Sarcio's book actually is worth noting here, that 27% of homicides where police officers kill a driver, excuse me, an unarmed person, happen in the car setting, right? So we've developed an entire new apparatus of policing, and it's caused, police civilian interactions that could be fraught as well. Just a quick note about the technologies driving legal and social structures. Electric cars were actually developed slightly before internal combustion automobiles. They were considerably more expensive, though. So consequently, manufacturers sought to introduce them as a sort of shared transportation option long before Uber and Lyft, right? A pricing collusion scandal tarnished the shared ownership model, and with the introduction of the Model T, cars featuring internal combustion engines achieved dramatically lower unit costs, so they caught on, and we moved from a model of shared vehicles to a model of private vehicle ownership. What else do we know now? This is from a book from a planning professor, Aaron Ben Joseph, and he notes that in some US cities, parking lots cover more than a third of the land area, becoming the single most salient landscape feature of our built environment. So technologies shape our cultures. I mean, we're at the New School, we can invoke McLuhan, right? We shape our tools, and thereafter our tools shape us. In more human terms, we can think about some other impacts of the automobile. Since 1899, more than 3.5 million people have died in traffic accidents in the United States, and more than 80 million have been injured. The road has emerged as the setting for our most violent illustrations of systemic racism. Combustion engines have helped create a climate crisis, and the quest for oil has led our soldiers into war. So just considering the automotive example for a moment, like what might we distill from the experience? I want to suggest that the features of a technology, such as cost, and like the technology, electric versus IC, drove patterns of usage and ownership, private or shared ownership. And so we can think about technologies more generally by thinking about what are the features of a given technology and how they might intersect with social practice and social institutions. Another guide for thinking about some of these questions comes in the form of Lewis Mumford. He writes that, my thesis, to put it bluntly, is that two technologies have currently existed side by side, one authoritarian, the other democratic. The first system-centered, immensely powerful, but inherently unstable. The other man-centered, relatively weak, but resourceful and durable. And Mumford calls these authoritarian and democratic techniques. I think we can move away from some of that language, but I think the framing is very interesting. And it builds on characterizations made by other observers and scholars. So, amid the dislocation of the European Industrial Revolution, Ingalls offered that famous example of how technologies might embed political arrangements by describing a cotton spinning mill as a structure that requires the coordination of many workers across many steps of the textile production process. So in structuring workers and the method, manner, and timing of their work, the dark satanic mills that Blake described assumed a totalizing control of workers' lives at work on account of what another SES scholar, Langdon Winner, would later term the authority of steam. Engels takes pains to point out that worker ownership of the cotton spinning factory is an inadequate remedy to the problem of dehumanizing mill work, as the coordination required to operate the mill necessitates the routinization of human work. The challenge to human expression is built into the mill itself. Let's see. I have, here we can skip this example for now to jump ahead and ask, how might these experiences help us think about space? So manufacturing oxygen, mining water, pressurizing habitations, blocking ionizing radiation, isolating dust and other contaminants, all of these activities will require capital-intensive technologies and finely calibrated control systems. Although it's possible to imagine a future in which the cost of these technologies declines, they contain what Mumford might have called an authoritarian politics, in as much as they require that actions by humans and machines be monitored, standardized, coordinated, and controlled. In a space context, human agency is going to be constrained for the sake of producing outcomes, namely human survival, right? So if all human activities in the space environment take place under the shadow of, like the arrangements of complex human machines that Mumford was describing, it's reasonable to assume that human relations in space will take on an authoritarian cast as well. So applying that quick framing or way of analyzing a technology, what are some of the features of the space environment that are going to be germane as we think about technology development for space habitation? I mean, space is big, it's lethal, it's resource poor, and heavily inflected by gravity, for economics and other kinds of considerations. We'll talk about the economics piece later. But space can kill you in a bunch of ways. The space environments are some of the most extreme conditions that humanity has experienced. Microgravity environments cause bone density losses and muscular atrophy due to decreased skeletal load. Movement across gravity fields, such as those of Earth, low Earth orbit, geosynchronous orbit, the moon, other celestial bodies, causes disruption to the vestibular system. So that distorts your balance, orientation, and movement. Physical confinement, limited human contact, and low light levels can induce mental health issues such as depression and anxiety, particularly on long duration missions. Ionizing radiation from solar flares and galactic cosmic radiation can cause depressed immune response, nausea and vomiting, fever, hemorrhaging, radiation sickness, and death. Outside of the spacecraft, the temperature and pressure extremes combined with a lack of breathable atmosphere can cause death within minutes. So to manage these and other, these are also some illustrations, like there's been a lot of human research on some of these things too, but on the ISS. But to manage these and other risks, environmental control and life support systems require the adherence to strict protocols to produce oxygen, manage heat and carbon dioxide, replenish water, prevent and manage fires, among many other habitability considerations. Astronauts' diet and exercise are prescribed and closely monitored in order to increase the body's resilience to the dangers of the space environment. Extravehicular operations are closely monitored in order to manage heat exchange, pressure changes, and water vapor. With this list, I'm enumerating only a fraction of the safety issues in space environments to underscore the centrality of procedure and surveillance of technological processes and human activity. To contemplate the patterns of human relations in future space societies, we have to reckon with the design logics of the technologies and the management systems that will order human beings. So, to sum up this part of the discussion, designs can incorporate political arrangements. Those arrangements can skew democratic or authoritarian, to use Mumford's framing, based on their internal structure and the institutions necessary for managing them. And the features of the space environment, because the environment is so lethal and dangerous, will favor authoritarian types of technologies wherein human activity is constrained, managed, and controlled. For good purpose, but this is just one of the design facts of this situation, right? So the next part, the next set of frames, actually, before we go on, were there any questions or comments on that first just overview? Hearing none, I'll move on to the second piece that I want to share with you. And this is about democratic or relational equality and this idea of private government. I'll explain what these mean, but in brief, I think we want to aspire to democratic equality, and democratic equality among future spacefarers is going to be threatened by this phenomenon of private government. So In order to talk about relational or democratic equality, I want to incorporate two arguments from the political philosopher Elizabeth Anderson. The first of those is relational or democratic equality. So democratic government is conditioned on the idea of relational equality, that every citizen is equal in stature, in rights and responsibilities, irrespective of any material differences between citizens. It's a lofty ideal and not always realized, but one person, one vote, justice is blind, a jury of one's peers, these and other notions draw their meaning from relational equality. Relational equality is challenged by social inequalities on Earth, but those challenges are exacerbated in contexts beyond Earth. The lethality of space and other extraterrestrial environments and the scope and expense of the material inputs required to convert natural resources into human usable supplies, they combine to challenge relational equality. So Anderson writes that equality is a pattern of relationships among people, not simply equal distributions of material resources. It assumes that people, not nature, are responsible for turning the natural diversity of human beings into oppressive hierarchies. So you could understand the second bullet point with reference to disability studies or accessibility engineering, right? If you don't have a ramp to enter a public building, that means that people who use wheelchairs will have a much more difficult time accessing that public building. This is a human choice and a human design decision. If we build in ramps for buildings or curb cuts on sidewalks, well, that means structures are more accessible. So this is what Anderson means when she writes that people, not nature, are responsible for turning the natural diversity of humans into oppressive hierarchies. And the last point on relational equality from Anderson is that it offers a philosophical basis for making demands to change human systems. So, for example, back to that wheelchair accessibility example, a person has, by making a demand on the society at large, that because of how I am, I deserve to be able to access these public buildings. Like that's an argument couched in relational or democratic equality. And it's the basis for making claims like the Americans with Disabilities Act and other pieces of legislation that remedy the ex ante designs and change them to make them more accessible. So I want to introduce another idea of Anderson's here, and that is private government, because both relational equality and private government are going to be key here. So Anderson describes private government by saying you are subject to private government whenever you are subordinate to authorities who can order you around and sanction you for not complying over some domain of your life. And the authorities treat it as none of your business across a wide range of cases, what orders it issues or why it sanctions you. Private government is government that has arbitrary, unaccountable power over those it governs. A government is private with respect to a subject if it can issue orders backed by sanctions to that subject or some domain of that subject's life, and that subject has no say in how that government operates and no standing to demand that their interests be taken into account in the decisions that that government makes. Anderson sees private government everywhere. She, I think appropriately and somewhat trollingly, she says that we live in communist dictatorships at work where the resources are socialized and pay is paid out in bands and so on. And we have to follow instructions from bosses all the time. Like government is not just a state. Government is any system that is organizing the affairs of people under its remit. So on our present trajectory, future human habitations, occupations, and economies in space will be organized as private governments because the corporations and wealthy individuals who will finance those endeavors will determine the system of objectives, rules, and sanctions that govern them. The lethality of the space environment will restrict the exit options of those to whom these future governments are private and will necessitate hierarchies of authority to produce the basic substrates of life. Under those sorts of conditions, authoritarian rather than democratic social relations would appear to be the likeliest arrangement, because it's difficult for a free society of equals to take root in a context in which surveillance is total, government is private, and non-compliance with authorities is lethal. I want to illustrate these points about relational equality and private government with reference to a couple of examples from contemporary American life. So this quotation comes from Emily Gundelsberger, who was a writer, but also working in an Amazon fulfillment center warehouse, describing the process of using a scan gun that sets tasks and measures the time to complete tasks. So she writes that the scan gun I used to do my job was also my personal digital manager. Every single thing I did was monitored and timed. After I completed a task, the scan gun not only immediately gave me a new one, but also started counting down the seconds I had left to do it. Now, these time to complete tasks and so on also factor into performance evaluations and whether you'll be retained or fired from Amazon, right? This is an example of a hierarchy of standing. So Anderson talks about hierarchy, like different types of social hierarchy threatening democratic equality. Those hierarchies are hierarchies of standing, authority, and esteem. This is an example of differential standing. Hierarchies of standing arise when someone's interest, when some people's interests are taken into account in greater measure than the interests of some other group of people. Contemporary service work is rife with examples of unequal standing, particularly through the lack of voice that many workers have within their workplaces. Now, for some more examples, consider that among restaurant workers, 90% report being subject to sexual harassment. A recent study of workers in the poultry industry found that the vast majority were not allowed adequate bathroom breaks. Many are forced to wear diapers. A recent study based on managers and employees estimates that about 7 million workers have been pressured by their bosses to favor some political candidate or issue. And they've been threatened by threats of job loss, wage cuts, or plant closure. Employers unilaterally determine work schedules with no employee input for half of all early career employees. The result, including unpredictable schedules, which afflict 41% of workers, fluctuating and short on-call and split shift work, where employees are sent home and called back in the same day. These things wreak havoc with the private lives of workers. They can't arrange childcare, they can't clear their schedules to take college classes or take on a second job needed to cover necessary expenses, and they're left with this like unpaid junk time in the middle of the day, often hours from home, and with no opportunity to spend it with friends and family. This is another example of that, the clopening, where one closes and opens the next. So like, what would you do with that in between time? There was a working paper from the Washington Center for Equitable Growth that I just wanted to highlight for a sec. And through it, I learned of the story of a worker who worked at 3 different Dunkin' Donuts in New Jersey and was sleeping in her car between shifts on a regular basis, and she died in the car. In this case, it was due, I believe, to carbon monoxide poisoning. I mean, these are some of the consequences of working under private government, not having standing to change the arrangements that govern your work, right? Now, oops, sorry about that. This isn't just a phenomenon of low wage or unskilled labor. And I want to share with you the experience of a NASA mission that illustrates how disparities of standing, authority, and esteem can endanger both missions and crew well-being. So the final mission for Skylab, which was the orbiting research station launched by NASA between the Apollo and Space Shuttle eras, was, this is Skylab 4, the whole mission there, was at 84 days. It was the longest running mission in crewed spaceflight in human history to date. And due to malfunctions and damaged spacecraft, NASA needed to compensate for lost time during the Lab 4 mission. Each of the 84 days had 16 hours of work time budgeted for the 3 astronauts who were going up for Skylab 4. According to an oral history provided by Mission Commander Gerald Carr in 2000, the astronauts began falling behind on their experimental work almost immediately due to the last-minute inclusion of several experiments and crew illness attributed to acclimating to microgravity. After setting up all of the equipment necessary to perform the mission's planned experiments, Carr explained, "That's where the schedule caught up with us. We found that we had allowed ourselves to be scheduled on the daily schedule, and the schedule was so dense that if you missed something, or if you made a mistake and had to go back and do it again, or if you were slow in doing something, you'd end up racing the clock and making mistakes, screwing up an experiment or not doing a procedure correctly." That went on for many, many days, and it was hard on our morale to be rushed like that and not to be able to get things done and get them completed and get the experiments done. We were sure that the experimenters on the ground were grinding their teeth when we would have to report, "Well, I didn't get this experiment done because in my rush, I put the wrong filter in, or I did this, or I did that." We found that it was almost to the point where you had to schedule time you could go to the bathroom. It was that tightly scheduled. At night, we would have dinner and we would go right back to the experiments, and we'd work until probably 9 o'clock at night. Then it would be time to wind down and go to bed. So at 10 o'clock, when we were supposed to be in bed, none of us were ready to go to sleep yet because we still had things to pick up and put away and to do things. Our minds were still moving too fast. So we just weren't getting the right kind of rest. We weren't getting the right kind of leisure time that would allow us to do the right kind of job. So what do NASA astronauts on an orbiting research station have in common with shift workers at Dunkin' Donuts or poultry factory workers? You see that it's this differential in standing and the ability to have authority over the way that your day is organized. And in the case of the Skylab 4 example, actually, the crew ended up sometime between Christmas and New Year's Eve while they were up there, they turned off their radio. And so like for 24 hours, they went on strike. They turned off communications to mission control. And a day later, they turned them back on and reestablished communications and renegotiated the way that they did their work. They said that, like we will not work under these conditions where everything is so tightly scheduled. And so, mission control ended up moving to a model of setting larger goals and objectives per unit time and allowing more operational flexibility for the astronauts to execute on that vision. And by the end of the mission, they had actually completed everything that every experiment and so on that they were meant to do, and had time to initiate experiments of their own and do some like public art and community engagement projects for students back on Earth and so on. And because there were NASA astronauts where, it cost hundreds of thousands of dollars an hour to keep them alive and on the space station, they had the ability to make this kind of claim on mission control. Other folks did not. And I think in a future society, if we're thinking, 100 years and change into the future where people were living and working in space, we might imagine that those workers have less standing and less authority to affect changes in their workplace than NASA astronauts in the 80s, right? So I want to offer another example of private government and action. This concerns a case that was, heard in the Second Circuit. The District Court for the Southern District of Alabama, but it concerned a company that had extended a job offer to a candidate, Ms. Jones, and rescinded the offer because she would not cut her hair. So when Ms. Jones said that she would not cut her hair, Ms. Wilson told her that the company could not hire her and asked her to return the paperwork that she had been given. At the time, CMS had a race-neutral grooming policy, which read as follows. All personnel are expected to be dressed and groomed in a manner that projects a professional and business-like image while adhering to company and industry standards or guidelines. Hairstyles should reflect a business or professional image. No excessive hairstyles or unusual colors are acceptable. The issue here was that she had dreadlocks and refused to cut them for work, and so lost this offer of employment. In my first job out of college, I got a talking to for wearing a hat as I walked through the office to my desk, whereupon I took the hat off when I sat down at my desk. but I got a talking to, and that was noted, right? A friend who used to work as a museum educator wasn't allowed to carry a water bottle like in tours or teaching, doing programming. These are all examples of private government where there is that kind of arbitrary, unaccountable power over how people live and exist while at work. If we extrapolate this to a space context where you are always at work, basically, because you are living on a spacecraft that requires tight operational controls for safety, we can imagine what private government, how extensive the control of private government might be in such a society. So these are a couple of frames. I want to just note some implications and next steps from considering them, right? Here's a Blue Origin job. Blue Origin is Jeff Bezos's private space company, right? For an orbital habitation formulation lead. Like, the job looks pretty cool. As Blue Origin's formulation lead for the orbital habitat development, for the orbital habitat product line, you will lead development of technical concepts, product strategies, business cases, customer relationships, market shaping outreach, industrial partnerships, and implementation approaches, supply chain. Sounds like a cool job, sounds like there's a lot to do, but it doesn't consider the governance and social relations, the implications on governance and social relations of living and working in space. It doesn't anticipate all of the skills necessary for building democratic social relations into the kinds of orbital habitations that they anticipate and are hiring for. Because I picked on Jeff Bezos, let's pick on Elon Musk for a sec. This is from the terms of service for SpaceX's Starlink constellation of satellites for communication. It's a network of satellites that exist in low Earth orbit to enable communications. And it's also anticipated that this network of satellites will enable communications between Earth and Mars. And so in their terms of service, Section 9, the parties recognize, so they say that, for applications on Earth and the Moon, they'll be subject to the laws of the state of California. But the parties recognize Mars as a free planet and that no Earth-based government has authority or sovereignty over Martian activities. Accordingly, disputes will be settled through self-governing principles established in good faith at the time of Martian settlement. This provision helps to illustrate the underlying assumption of private government, and it doesn't anticipate all the skills necessary for building democratic social relations into the Martian society that SpaceX anticipates. It kind of boils down to trust us, right? So I think with some of these reference points, we restate the challenge, right? In any long-running private enterprise in space, it will be likely that public governance regimes will converge on private operational and strategic management regimes, such that private operational and strategic management regimes become a default kind of government for a given habitation. Today on Earth, we see companies such as Facebook increasingly internalizing governance functions, such as adjudication of free speech claims, determinations of surveillance and public safety protocols, and execution of counterintelligence operations. Just, early, like one of the cases before Facebook's Supreme Court is whether and under what circumstances people can be banned entirely from Facebook. And this is germane to the case of, former President Donald Trump, right? This is a private company already determining these sorts of speech claims, in addition to claims about radicalization and, propaganda spreading and disinformation campaigns and so on. New space actors building tomorrow's space economy and settlements will also likely need to assume government-like functions, much in the way that social media and other companies are doing this on Earth today. And some of these government-like functions will likely be implicit in the technology designs deployed in a given habitation or spacecraft. So how do we make the government and these governance decisions public things that are capable of, that can be subject to democratic debate and accountability, So I see a design challenge then in designing space habitation technologies and management systems that enable democratic equality among future spacefarers. Now, I want to pause actually, because I've got some other slides showing some projects that are in the offing and some ideas for how that might work, but I want to exit full screen so I can see if folks have thoughts or questions, comments before we go on.
I jump in.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I have a question about scale. You know, your examples of Amazon and poultry workers seems like these are very specialized, very localized industries, and I could absolutely see that authoritarian construction sort of applied there. But what do you think about the idea and examples of, okay, if you're in a spaceship, or if you're just landing on Mars, but what do you see the possibility of scale, not only numbers of people, right, but also proliferation of different entities or companies in one space as a way to overcome some of this? Thinking about this in terms of sort of like division of labor, sort of might push towards this relational equality that you're talking about. One could imagine, for example, instead of, and this is really out there because cost would be prohibitive, but one could imagine instead of sending 12 folks to Mars, send like 1,000. And what happens when you have that type of scale at the onset, instead of I'm assuming that over time scale must have some sort of effect on this, right?
Well, I mean, how would you think about the differences in scale between some of the examples that we were just walking through and the types of scale that you expect to see?
Yeah, I mean, I think that
in space settlements.
Yeah, I think relationships between, okay, if we land, we're 12, right? And we're constrained by the fact that we need to get water, make air, right? Versus if we land and we're 1,000, right? So there's some people that are making air, some people getting water. That eases up some of that pressure to that's sort of survival pressure, right? So that's the way I'm thinking about it. I mean, I know that in terms of cost-wise, that doesn't make sense. But I'm trying to think, how does one bootstrap? How does one kick off the possibility of having, I guess, more democratic equality in spaces like this?
Well, thank you for the question, and also for elaborating on it a bit for me. Like, when we're thinking about scale, I mean, like the first settlers on Mars, I even hate that term settler, but like the first humans that are going to go and live on Mars, right? That's probably going to be a small community of very specialized people, right? And so, like, let's say that's, I'm making this up, but let's say that's 20 years off, right? Project further 120 years in the future, like thinking about the automobile example. I mean, the automobile at first was this technology that was accessible only to super rich leisure capitalists, right? And, it ended up being the thing that remakes cities and shapes our lives, shapes our relationship to work and one another and so on. And it's even the stuff of imagination. I was watching a TV show the other night and like just seeing like the car ads. I mean, like this, like they're cultural artifacts as well. And so this thing that started out with really small application becomes like a universal kind of touch point and a major criterion for shaping society. I imagine we'll follow similar trajectories in space. So, the first sorts of missions like this are going to be smaller. These are, going to be less, like the questions are going to be less pertinent in the nearer term future of space exploration. I think they're going to be more pertinent as we go further. I was referencing the work of Blue Origin earlier. I mean, Jeff Bezos has a vision of, you know, hundreds of millions or billions of humans living in orbiting space stations surrounding the Earth, and making Earth more like also like moving heavy industry to the moon and things like that, and making the Earth more of like a grand public park kind of thing. But you know, we could, you know, I forget his line exactly, but he's like, if there were, you know, billions more humans, we could have 1,000 Mozarts and 1,000 Einsteins and so on. So he's thinking about this on a huge scale. And I want to speak about like some of these space entrepreneurs, because they are shaping the public imagination of what we're doing and what for, right? And so when you're talking at the scales that like some of like these space visionaries are imagining and securing government contracts for, and like building technology to realize, you know, that orbital habitation formula lead job description. I mean, that is the vision for that, is like a network of orbiting space stations that house millions of people, right? So we're going to get to scale if some of these visions end up being realized. And so I think it's important to start thinking now about the rules, forgive the analogy, but like rules of the road for governance, for how we can begin to do that work of making claims on one another. And so I think that it seems like a narrow or almost like toy or academic kind of example when we're thinking about a group of 12 people, because like, sure, you could probably sort it out, but these are precedent establishing behaviors, that there are path dependencies with technology development as well, you know. And so if a company, like you don't want to accidentally depressurize a part of a space station, for example. So there are going to be rules that are hard coded into the architecture of these things. Like how then do we consider the accumulation of all these rules, and where are they coming from, and like what scope do we have for collectively managing them? Another point about scale, I'll reference this briefly if we into it. I've got some slides we can walk through about this, but like we have to think about like monopoly and natural monopoly in space, because space is so big and gravity wells cause so much of a differential in cost in this competitive structure, right? Like if you already have a lunar base, your launch costs are going to be 5% of the launch costs of a base on Earth, and you're launching material into space, right? And so like they're much in the way that like electricity provision, you know, lends itself, or internet or something lends itself to natural monopoly. We could anticipate forms of natural monopoly for space resource utilization in space, you know, and that's another question of scale too, like the vastness of space. How do we think about like some of these questions of competition? I think in order to have democratic politics, like small d democratic politics, you need some checks on the kinds of institutions that are going to be operating at this kind of scale. So that's an imperfect answer, but there are a couple of things there that hopefully address your point, you know, but I thank you for raising it.
I don't see any other questions in the chat. If you want to carry on, David, I know you had a couple more slides. And if anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand or toss them in here. Roberto, did you have a question you wanted to bring in? Okay, copy. Yeah, carry on, David.
Alrighty. Let's see. Are you seeing the slide again?
Yes.
Affirmative.
Oh, okay, brilliant, thanks. So this question, how might we design space habitation technologies and management systems that enable democratic equality among future spacefarers? Like this is an open question. And I think like we're gonna see some interesting bits of public participation and contribution to understanding some of these questions. I've got a couple of thoughts on areas where we might want to focus some attentions and some initial thoughts that I figured I'd share with you, toss them out there and see how they sit with you. So one is examining how we think about rights and ownership and the way that these things are bundled together. There's the Outer Space Treaty, which is this formative document, that was agreed to by all the world's spacefaring powers during that first space age, proposed that the exploration of space would be carried out for the benefit of and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of development, and shall be the province of all mankind, right? Outer space, including the moon and other celestial bodies, is not subject to national appropriation by claim of sovereignty, by means of use or occupation or any other means. Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty has been this guiding ethic for how we think about like asteroid mining or setting up other operations on celestial bodies, right? That has been changing over the last few years. So I have here an excerpt from the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act in the US in 2015. And it was meant to mobilize capital to the end of exploiting space materials for consumptive use. And so, you know, how do we build more of like a private sector for space mining activities, basically? A US citizen engaged in commercial recovery of an asteroid resource or a space resource under this chapter shall be entitled to any such resource, including possessing, owning, transporting, using, and selling the resource. So this is US law. And the passage of this law in 2015 in the US spurred other countries like the UAE and Luxembourg to begin, well, Luxembourg and the UAE, to begin their own processes of establishing property rights for space exploration and mining companies. More recently, under the Trump administration, the US has moved to a policy of bilateral negotiations for managing resources on the moon, the Artemis Accords. And so we're moving away from the ethos of that, you know, Outer Space Treaty of 1967, and we're seeing more bilateral kinds of agreements and larger private sector development of some of these space activities. Are we able to, let's see, those pieces of legislation present different worldviews. And I think one of the challenges here is that we can understand the challenge here with reference to other types of enclosure. If we think about the view of space resources in the Outer Space Treaty, they constitute something of a global commons. You know, it's not owned by anyone, but it's meant to be for the benefit of all, right? Can be used freely by all, but not owned and appropriated individually. We're moving from that vision of the commons to a vision of more private enclosure of space-based resources, right? And so we can understand this with reference to another act of enclosure, and this concerns the enclosures in England in the 16th century. And so law professor and a physicist actually who wrote this book, The Ecology of Law, described this enclosure of the commons in England in the 16th century thusly. They write that the transformations required the extraction, accumulation, and mobilization of staggering amounts of natural and human resources, later to be understood as capital. The intensity of the process of transforming common land into private property has no precedent in history. A contemporaneous account of what that looked like comes from Sir Thomas More. He was writing this book, Utopia. Himself was an accomplished lawyer. He was a chancellor of the early courts of equity. but in this book, he describes the use, like the implications of this kind of enclosure of these commons, these lands that the peasantry used for farming and their own uses, right? He writes that your sheep, which are naturally mild, may now be said to devour men and unpeople, not only villages but towns. For wherever it is found that the sheep of any soil yield a softer and richer wool than ordinary, there the nobility and gentry, even these holy men, the abbots, not contented with the old rent, stop the course of agriculture and enclose grounds that they may lodge their sheep in them. These enclosures, like ultimately ended up providing the feedstock for the mills that we talked about earlier, right? Like the English textile industry required producing lots more wool. To do that, common lands that people had used for their own subsistence farming and so on were enclosed through legal procedure and appropriated and treated as private property, so much so that someone writing in 1516 can say that sheep may now be said to devour men and unpeople because they have taken the land that was used for farming. So how do we think about ownership, and how do we think about the rights and limitations of that? This framework comes from law professor Lawrence Becker in 1980, but he frames ownership as a bundle of rights. And we can see what they are here. I mean, for our purposes of discussion, we don't need to get into what the rights and limitations are, but there's a set of rights subject to certain limitations, and that's how he construes ownership. And we might wonder, well, what are other ways of developing systems of ownership for space-based resources? Can we think about the bundle of rights and reconfigure the bundle of rights? So just for example, like if you're very fortunate and have a trust fund that pays you, you are literally the owner of those assets in the trust fund, right? But it's managed by someone, by a trustee who has a fiduciary duty to act in your interest. But like you can't say like, oh, I want to sell everything and buy lots of fast cars and mansions when I'm 18 years old, if the trust is managed in a way that you're meant to benefit from it, right? So like this idea of ownership, is a complicated thing. I mean, does the trust fund like own those assets? Yes, but there are limitations on using those assets because there are limitations of use and management of the thing, right? So we can think about ownership as bundling all of these different kinds of rights together. And so we could possibly reconfigure the bundle of ownership rights for space-based resources, for example. So what would it mean to mine resources that are owned with a different bundle of rights than we think of when we think of a different bundle of rights when we think of possess, own, transport, use, and sell, as we see in the Space Resource Exploration and Utilization Act, for example.
David,
So,
I'm going to cut in really quick on this, if you don't mind. We have a question in the chat that I think will problematize and kind of situate some of this. Yusuf Ahmed's asking a question kind of about zones. As you're talking about rights asymmetry, I think it kind of plays into this. But they ask, what are the implications of the shift to this kind of bilateral national approaches to space policy that you mentioned before? Does this become like maritime activity where ships register in low governance jurisdictions? And I'm thinking about this asymmetry of rights as well that you've brought up since then and the way that plays in. So a few points to pull on though.
Sure. So the Space Resource Act in the US and the Luxembourg legislation do this. It seems the UAE and Russia will have similar legislation soon. All of these pieces of legislation stipulate that a launch from a given country means that the launching entity is subject to the jurisdiction of the launching company. Excuse me, the launching country. So if SpaceX is launching from California, or Blue Origin from Texas, or NASA from Florida, whatever, like these are all the companies that are, or the entities undertaking this work are subject to the jurisdiction of the country from which they launch. I think that some of these questions about jurisdiction get a little bit more complicated when we think about the development of in situ space resource utilization, right? Like, let's say that you're a company that, you know, launched some stuff in 2050 from the US, and you've got a base on the moon, you're mining helium-3 or whatever, and you're using your 3D printing lunar regolith, you know, the moon dirt, like you're 3D printing that into other structures, right? Like whatever it is. At what point do you stop being subject to national legislation? It's kind of like a ship of Theseus problem, you know, like, you know, or like how far back do you go to be governed by a given nation? And if we imagine, you know, let's say someone launches from Luxembourg, and you know, soon their annual revenues exceed those of the host country, and there are power imbalances. I mean, Apple has, you know, like more cash assets than some countries' GDP already, right? You know, we have examples of this, and so you wonder, like, oh well, to what degree will some of these actors actually be subject to the jurisdiction of the countries from which they launch? So that's at least a partial set of like considerations there. Is that getting at your point, Yusuf, or is there more that we can uncover there?
Yeah, no, that's
If
helpful.
perfect. Thank you, Yusuf. If you have anything more to speak to it, feel free to jump in. Another thing I was thinking about, the way it's launched based on the country of origin, it reminds me very much of legislature currently around the internet, and the way, you know, a lot of pirating sites will hide in somewhere like Hungary, where you can't necessarily subpoena information, etc. And Peter Heft here in the chat is adding to that to ask, what if a country you launch from ceases to exist? And how does that change kind of the heredity of the space resources and those companies?
That's a great question. I haven't thought about that at all. But I mean, I wonder if there are analogs to the earlier point in the maritime context. You know, like, you know, were there merchant marines for like for the Soviet Union, and after the dissolution of the USSR, like what happens to that? I don't know, and I think that's a fascinating question. There'd be some analogs there that are useful to examine. And just as a quick aside, you know, a lot of folks who do space policy look at maritime law as inspiration for space law, and borrow concepts and examples from the maritime context. So I do think it's a good place to look. Was there any more on, again, I can't see anything in the chat, so sorry.
Yeah, thank you. The chat's currently cleared out. So if you want to continue, I know you've moved on to more slides here, but we'll pull up anything else that is.
I mean, they're just slides, so it's fine. But one thing, well, let's see, I've got the slide up here. I might as well talk about it for a sec. But you know, we can think about types of goods, and so right now, like the legislation, the new legislation that we've been discussing, conceptualizes space assets as private goods. But you know, we can. This comes from work by Elinor Ostrom, who is an economist who won the Nobel Prize and I believe died in 2010, 2012, something like that. But her scholarship examines common pool resources and how people manage common pool resources. And an example of a common pool resource could be a commons, like we saw, like being enclosed in England earlier. Common pool resources include groundwater basins, forests, and fisheries, and other sorts of things. There are different, like Ostrom's work is an exploration of this concept of polycentric governance. So rather than, hey, you know, it's this one state or this one body that regulates this area of the sea where people are fishing, you know, like we can consider governance in such a space because it's hard to exclude people from fish. Sorry, I should talk about the chart here for a sec. So subtractability of use is high, difficulty of exclusion is high, and in those contexts, the good can be characterized as a common pool resource. In that case, think about fish in the sea, right? If there's a section of the sea where cod is being fished, you fish, you take cod out of the sea, subtractability of use is high, right? For example, the subtractability of use for air is low on Earth. So like we would say that difficulty of exclusion high, subtractability of use low, that's a public good. Things like clean air are public goods, right? My breathing on Earth does not impact your breathing very much. And so subtractability of use is low. In the case of fishing, subtractability of use is high and difficulty of exclusion is high. It's hard to keep, in a big chunk of sea, like it's hard to keep an individual fishing vessel from entering and fishing in a given region, right? So for these kinds of common pool resources, Ostrom and her collaborators and people who've elaborated on her work have suggested that better ways of governing these types of goods come from what they call polycentric governance institutions. So it's independent bodies that accredit fishing vessels. It's individual fishing vessels that are making sure that other fishing vessels aren't fishing during mating season for the fish or some such. Like that the operators in a given space contribute to the governance of that space, and that they form bodies and associations at multiple levels. So it's you see monitoring at the level of individual fishing vessels. You see fishery monitoring at the level of a body that accredits people who are eligible to fish and when they're eligible to fish and so on. There are national and international agreements that are overlapping. All of this stuff constitutes polycentric governance. And so there are folks who are thinking about polycentric governance institutions and what they might look like for space resources. There's Frederick Moran and Eitan Tepper at Laval University in Canada are like leading a project right now, trying to map the number of actors in low Earth orbit. And as they try to understand like what an inventory of actors might look like for managing the common pool resource of low Earth orbit. Sorry, I should elaborate on low Earth orbit. This is where you see lots of small satellites and other things operating. We were talking about the SpaceX's Starlink program that's happening in low Earth orbit. The challenge there is one of pollution. It's debris. Defunct satellites can crash into active satellites and create lots of debris, then flies around at tens of thousands of miles per hour, and will like a fleck of paint can put a hole in a satellite and knock out a $300 million piece of equipment or something. And so how do we avoid polluting the low Earth orbit with space debris? That's an example of another commons management problem. So Moran and Tepper are leading this project, like mapping the different actors in the space as an input to the kinds of polycentric governance institutions that we see for common pooled resources on Earth. So maybe as we think about classifying types of goods in space, be they materials that can be mined on celestial bodies, or be they like actual orbits and I want to say airspace, but orbit is more accurate. Like, can those things be managed with institutions that we have some analogies for? And what does that do for the kinds of rights that actors affect in a given context? So the question there is, how should we consider space resources? Another set of considerations concerns the scope and type of competition. And this is what I was alluding to in the earlier exchange after our first break there. But gravity in space influences economics quite hugely, as it were. Escaping Earth's gravity well requires as much energy as it would to launch 6,400 kilometers upward under constant Earth gravity. Escaping the moon's gravity well requires as much energy as it would to launch 288 kilometers upward under constant Earth gravity. that's a difference. Like it's 95% less expensive to launch an escape from a gravity well from the moon than it is for Earth, for example. This is the point I was making earlier about the potential for natural monopolies to form absent policy intervention. So that's a whole other consideration. How do we think about competition policy as we develop space economies, right? Just as a little inspiration here, I mean, Neil deGrasse Tyson has said that the first trillionaire there will ever be is the person who exploits natural resources on asteroids. And the political scientist at Stanford, Larry Diamond, writes that there are 23 countries in the world that derive at least 60% of their exports from oil and gas, and not a single one of them is a real democracy. So there's a tendency for resource extractive industry to tend away from democratic governance, in part because of the capital requirements and the potential to capture the wealth from these resources. So we should be thinking about that as we think about space policy. And right now there's a lot of momentum and energy and excitement around the commercialization of space. And, you know, in some respects, it's very good because there are more actors building new technologies and developing new services that are cool. You know, like we use space-based services to get a car or, you know, and to get a ride when we need it. It's awesome. But, you know, as we think about more development, particularly like the physical distances required and so on, how do we stop the moon from becoming a gas station, as Wilbur Ross, who was the former Secretary of Commerce, once termed it? You know, how do we think about managing the commons like water? You know, this is, you know, now defunct planetary resources. Said water, the key resource in space. It's the new oil and so on. How do we stop a gold rush or oil boom in space? Or how do we develop the capability to act in these environments without all of the dislocation and horrors that we've inflicted, right, on Earth? There's the issue when we think about the bigness of space of compounding advantage. This is, you know, of course, Thomas Piketty here, rate of return versus growth rate, you know, like over the course of, you know, human civilization. And the return to capital is greater than the rate of economic growth overall. And so you see this compounding advantage. That was the main Piketty insight, right?
I'm going to interrupt at this point. Peter Heft has a question, raising his hand, so I'll let him ask that. And then Yusuf has another question in the chat, so I'll bring that up after.
Okay.
Oh, well, I think Yusuf should probably go first because Yusuf has to go shortly as per their comment. So Yusuf says, will you still hold these democratic views when you're mining asteroids, David?
It was a tongue-in-cheek comment. Thanks for the talk. I got around, but thanks again.
Well, yes. if I, you know, can bend the ear of Jeff Bezos, I'll still be very motivated to see democratic forms and social relations in space.
So you'll be the first space trillionaire, though.
Not very likely, but.
But all right, so I guess something that I'm thinking about, like getting back to the issues of like governance, is like, so. I think I understand what you're saying about the distinction between private and public, although you didn't say public, but there seems to be an implicit distinction between private and public government, wherein a private government coerces you, you don't have a say, and what seems to be crucial is that actions against the will of the government result in corporeal harm. That was at least my understanding from a while ago, and I guess I'm not entirely sure like how well that maps onto the potential for governance in space, because like the lethality of not complying with say like, hey, you need to make sure you take your CO2 scrubber with you, or like, you got to make sure you have enough oxygen when you're out there digging up that helium-3. Like even though that's like a mandate, even though that might be a mandate from a government that you have like no say in or whatever, the negative corporeal implications have nothing to do with the government acting upon you. It just has to do with like you being out there and realizing, oh snap, I should have listened to them. Now I'm out of oxygen and I'm dead, right? So like there seems to be like a disconnect there, if you get what I'm saying.
I think I'm following you, and I want to offer an example, and you tell me if this is responsive to your concern there. I mean, I think what you're doing is basically describing a version of like the satanic mills, right? Like that, it's the logic of steam, or the authority of steam, not like the ownership structure of the mill, for example, that sets people's work schedules and like their routines on the job and so on. And that's true. I think that there are some potential remedies there, though, when we think about what are the ultimate aims of a given enterprise, right? Like I think this is one of the things I want to do some more research into, but I'm curious about the example of chartering corporations for particular purposes, or for particular durations, or within particular spaces, right? If we see that there may be natural monopolies forming, given the vastness of space and the economics of launches and all the other stuff, maybe we just acknowledge that that's going to be the case, and so we say there will be a monopoly for X period of time. And a company that, or an organization or entity or whatever, that is granted that monopoly to operate in a particular place, perhaps that is, in order to get the monopoly, you have to stipulate that there will be some degree of workplace democracy, in order to like say like, hey, this is the aim, or this is how revenues will be distributed. These will be the working conditions. We won't have times where people are petitioning for bathroom breaks, because they're scheduled so thoroughly. Like, okay, well, we'll have to staff this in a way such that people will have 8 hours of time over a 24-hour period to sleep, for example, or whatever it is. I think you could start layering other kinds of institutional forms on top of that, right? Like, maybe we say that there, for public financing mechanisms, like in order to access these development funds, or in order to access a landing site, you need to stipulate to certain certain tenets of workplace democracy, for example. Like that might be one way around some of what you're describing, Peter. And I don't know if that's fully responsive. So tell me, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think it is. I think there's a lot more I could ramble about, but I don't want to take up too much air in our limited our limited bubble. So I want to cede the floor to Roman, who had a question.
Well, thank you for that.
Hi, and thank you. Yes, actually, I had a question that I wanted to ask you, David, and thank you very much for this talk. It was a lot of interesting information for me. I'm connecting from Sweden, so it's a little bit late at night. I don't know if I think that clearly.
Wow, you are a real hero. Thank you for coming.
There's not that much about space, so you need to adjust to the schedule that exists in the world. I do some studies in the space policy, and actually the question that I had to you is that it sounds to me that the whole idea that it's based on, what you said to us today, is based on the idea that equality and democracy are desired in space projects. And I think actually there is a problem with this, because if we're talking about the projects which are international, it might be that not everybody is sharing this this idea, this ground of the values that we have as an axiom in this case. This is, I think, in particular, what is the trouble with the Outer Space Treaty, which is outdated. Everybody is aware of this. And there have been the ideas what to do with this from the sides of the US, from China, from Russia, but this led to absolutely nothing. It didn't get accepted, any of the proposals that were the new ones. So on this notion, you can say, okay, you know, we have these troubles that is very hard to solve. And then we had an example of the companies and corporations, which, yes, they put these strange types of things, like which type of the haircut you should wear, but they got past this idea of how to make a project that is international, at the same time as not get into the conflict of the values. So I wonder if we're talking about on this level, if we accept that not everybody wants the idea of equality and democracy in the space colony or in the space enterprise, how do we deal with this in this case? What's the implications for the technology? Who is going to make a project of the technology that is going to make the account of all of these views, which are likely to be incommensurable altogether? I don't know if it's clear.
Well, I appreciate your question, Roman. It's hard talking about democracy during a period of what Freedom House calls a democratic recession the world over, right? You know, like, I mean, I'm in the U.S. talking about democracy, like, you know, it's challenging, period. And people have different levels of attachment to democratic values and so on, right? And I think that the reason why I am a proponent of democratic forms in space almost has less to do with the kind of government and like government institution, but rather the kinds of social relations that we'll see, the way people will interact and work with and see and each other and live with each other. I think that kind of democratic equality that I was describing earlier, that idea of the one person, one vote, you know, that whole thing, like the jury of one's peers, right? I think that is a powerful ideal. And I think that it is, I think it's very important. You know, all of our theorizing around liberty and rights and so on assumes free air, right? Like we're going to be, you know, like developing larger scale deployments of humans in living and working in space. Like we have to recognize the sensitivity of our very beings to like the ways that we see one another. And I just actually, for example, like there's this whole literature around social identity and social identity theory, how we form, this is in psychology, how we determine the delineations between us and them, who's a part of the in-group, who's a part of the out-group. And like a lot of this work, and you know, has been replicated in lots of interesting settings and so on, shows that we favor people who are part of an in-group and we disfavor people who are part of an out-group. We are likely to, you know, and the differentiator for who's in and who's out can be a really arbitrary one. Like I remember one study shows that people who were shown like very quickly, like dots on a screen, you know, are grouped into high estimators and low estimators of the number of dots on the screen. And when you know which group that you've been assigned to, you're more likely to share resources with your in-group and deprive them from folks in the out-group. And like that's one small example of this larger phenomenon, right? In space societies and economies that are characterized by the kinds of totalizing environments of government, you know, like I mean government in this Elizabeth Anderson sense, right? Of not a state, but just of like this authority that's ordering you around. When every part of your life, when you're living and working in space, is subject to all of these rules and strictures about where you can go, where you can be. Like if you are an engineer, you have certain privileges, and if you're like a biologist or a botanist, you have other kinds of privileges and rights. And so in a habitation, you can imagine that there are going to be lots of distinctions based on work roles in these future space habitations. I worry about differentials in esteem among those kinds of spacefarers. Like, are we going to have, we see, you know, in the US, like hierarchies of race and racial group, right? You know, that like an arbitrary set of distinctions causes people to have lower birth weights, higher infant mortality, higher poverty, you know, higher instances of being, you know, subject to violence and so on. I think that the basis for those kinds of social outcomes will shift to as a function of work relationships, because those are going to be the most salient identities that people have in space. And so one of my big, yeah, and I appreciate your question because you're forcing me to articulate this, but I think one of my big assumptions here is that we want social identities and that people can revert to that have at some baseline this view of equality between people. And I think that we can take some of those insights from the behavioral sciences and everything we've learned in the past couple hundred years to rethink the basis for institutional design. Like I think about like the liberal democracies today, you know, are founded on these kinds of Enlightenment ideals of, oh, well, humans are rational, and so let's have deliberative fora where people debate things, because then, you know, like we can reason together and then arrive at some compromise or what have you. We know more about human nature now. We know that people don't think just as individuals. We think in groups, you know, we think in terms of social identity. That's the, like those material distribution tasks I was alluding to earlier, like those are organized by identity. I mean, humans have evolved as social beings, and the cognitive architectures that produce reason in humans are more typically recruited to justify prior social commitments, right? And to preserve favorable images of the self. I think like this is where like the research into boundedly rational cognition and comes in, and like identity protective cognition, all of these ideas that show that like we don't actually reason as like 18th century Enlightenment philosophers thought we did. And so we have institutions that are designed based on this operating premise that doesn't really hold so much. I'm saying that I think that in future space societies, we want to have a baseline, this idea of democratic equality, and that becomes a foundation on which we build a whole host of institutions. Now, I don't know if that's an adequate answer to your question, but I'm trying to get at some of the below the waterline of this iceberg here, and I think that that's part of it, right? That we want to create a people or peoples that that have the basis for making claims on one another. And I guess that's my big animating concern there. Now that might be like too high level, and we can drill down into what that means for company X or what have you, but I think that's my prior option. I want to articulate it for you.
Thank you. And I think Mauricio has a question if you want to jump in.
Yes, I have a question. It's actually a two-part question. I'll try to be brief. So the first one is, when you're doing your research, how much do you go back to like the history of colonization and the ways that we, well, at least the world kind of grew from the 15th century onward? Like I'm taking a class on that and it just seems connected. So I want to know how you connect that, or if you do, with your research. And also, I've been listening to what you're saying, and I'm wondering if the designs that you are talking about, like democratic design for space, is it compatible with capitalism? And is it possible to believe in a future where we have space capitalism and there's a democratic form of governance? Like I know that's a broad question, but it's something I was like thinking about.
Well, thanks for your question there, Mauricio. I think I am learning more about colonial and imperial histories in the course of trying to think about this stuff. Like actually just yesterday, I was on a call with some indigenous scholars, some folks from NASA, and you know, like other like space agency folks who trying to think about how we incorporate anti-racist and anti-colonial ideas into the, well, in this case, like there was a group that submitted a white paper to NASA for their decadal survey of like, hey, what should we work on for the next decade? You know, like some of the folks on this call were an author of a white paper saying like, hey, we need to incorporate and center more anti-colonial, anti-racist stuff. And so I'm trying to get involved and deepen my understanding in these spaces because I think that's really important. I think like indigenous cosmologies offer other ways of thinking about, you know, like rather than, to your point about like wither space capitalism, I mean, like in different cosmologies and worldviews from different peoples, we, you know, like some folks see a pile of rocks with resources, other folks see a sacred object, other, you know, like we can interact with these things differently depending on our worldviews. And so I think a lot of work in this space has to be, you know, democratic and participatory. Like we need folks who are coming from different points of orientation to translate those perspectives into into insights for how we proceed. So that's at least a partial answer to your first question. To the point about space capitalism, I mean, you know, I do wonder whether our current vision of capitalism is compatible with democratic equality or human freedom in future space habitations. I mean, like years ago, John Maynard Keynes was saying, you know, the famous British economist macroeconomist who developed the field of macroeconomics and came up with the measure of GDP and, you know, like counter-cyclical demand spending from governments to combat recessions and motivating the animal spirits of people, like this big time economist, right, who helped shape the post-World War II global order. You know, he thought capitalism would run its course over a period of around 400 years because he was like, at some point, you know, he in this essay in the 1930s at the height of the Great Depression, he wrote that it was an essay called The Economic Possibilities of Our Grandchildren. And it's like, at some point in the future, we will see that, you know, chasing profit the way we're doing is actually a social pathology. And so we need to get to a place of sufficient material plenty. And after that, we'll start seeing that this is not a way to live. And I think that this is where we start running up against sustainability considerations as well, right? You know, so Keynes in that essay, actually, just as an aside, he projected the size of global GDP and was fairly accurate in some of these projections. He underestimated the growth rate but he still ended up like accurate. But he thought by around 2030s, like we would have enough and we would change. And it doesn't seem like we're on course for that now. So I do think that there need to be reckonings and over the kind of timescales that I'm thinking about here. You know, if we're thinking 100, 150 years in the future for space stuff, we're going to have to see massive changes to earthly capitalism during that period, just for the sake of environmental sustainability and dealing with climate crisis. So I don't know what version of capitalism we might have, or what versions of capitalism we might have by the time that some of these developments in space are taking place. So those are just some thoughts. I don't know. I don't want to come down too strongly on any particular view because the future is an uncertain thing, you know.
I'm going to read out a quick follow-up from Roman here, from your conversation before, but he asks, would you agree with that line of space advocacy that claims hardships in space, air, water, etc., are necessary to arrive at some new universal view of humanity that does not seem possible on Earth? And Roman, if you want to jump in and correct this, but I'm reading it as a question of like, does that break with the Earth, and our assumptions here allow us to maybe imagine something outside of capitalism, outside of our current governing forms, etc.?
Yes, there is a number of space advocates which make a case for the programs in space on Mars, on Moon, and so on, that claims that these projects are necessary to find some kind of the common ground, because we cannot find it now. And if we are in the, let's say, in a simplistic way, if we are in the environment where we have to deal with the issues, how to produce air for everyone, how to make the water for everyone, then we will be, then we will have no other choice but to find the common ground that we cannot find in the conditions of the abundance of resources. That's the basic thought.
I don't know. I mean, what do you think, actually?
I would not agree with this. I in general don't agree with the space advocates, but I just, because you said about these things about air and the extra issues and hardships that that come with the establishment of the space colonies and space projects, and I just wonder if you thought about this in this way as well or not.
Well, I mean, I think certainly adversity or like, just think about like design constraints on Earth, right? Like if you're designing for, well, one of my colleagues a couple of years ago was involved in like a solar farm in, oh geez, somewhere in the Sahel. I don't remember exactly where, but you know, like one of the challenges with solar photovoltaic panels arrayed in this terrain was that they get covered with dust, you know, and sand and so on, so their efficiency drops. And so that kind of constraint, you know, like, hey, if I have solar panels on my house in New York, that's a different set of operating circumstances than in this solar farm project in the Sahel, right? And so in that case, that's a constraint that forces a different kind of innovation, right? And so we see examples of this all over the place. I suppose, I don't know, I'm a little pessimistic regarding the prospects for these kinds of constraints automatically, without real guidance and effort, producing more beneficent social relations. I think that's a vision of a lot of space folks. I think you know, I mean, we see that in like those terms of service for SpaceX for the Starlink program, when they say for Mars, like, hey, well, you know, like Mars is free territory and we'll resolve disputes, you know, like as they arise, because we are capable of that. And I think that view takes a very, I think elevates the role of, frankly, I think it takes that kind of antiquated view, like that Enlightenment view of enlightened self-interest, homo economicus, like rational decision making, you know, like, and I think it ignores some of the challenges that we'll see in these constrained environments. I think in times of scarcity, you see more retreats to tribe and smaller group affiliation. And I think that's partly to inform the democratic crises that we're seeing the world over now, right? So I suspect that without like real deliberate effort, we're not going to arrive at that. But this is just me conjecturing, you know? Oh, yeah, Katerina Pfister is really good. I took a class with her a few years ago. The Code of Capital is something I'd recommend. Well, it's a book of hers where she talks about the ways that law is used to encode certain assets and practices as capital, and as such, you know, like the things of wealth. It might be an interesting, actually, I'll just pop that in the chat.
Yeah, I heard her lecturing about that book, and she talked very much about the kind of private governments of all the colonies in the Americas. And it's come up to my mind a few times in this discussion. So I figured it might be a good reference to Mauricio thinking about the co-creation of capitalism and colonialism. So.
Well, I mean, I think one of Pfister's, you know, and I'm a little rusty in the argument here, but I think that one of her points is that like law is a social tool, it's a technology, and we can determine the ends of these technologies, and if we leave them, like if we go the black box algorithm route for technology development, we'll end up with a different kind of future than we will if we choose a different vision of law,
Do you know of any game theoretic simulations of what life and how scarcity is gonna play in outer space?
No, I don't. And, I'm sure there are some interesting ones. At one point, I had this idea to do like this agent-based modeling project where we could, test the efficacy of different governance configurations for like optimized for resource utilization or resource preservation or things like that. I ended up having to put that on the shelf for a while, but I think someone could probably do something interesting with that, and I'd be interested in seeing it. But I'm unfamiliar with any game theoretic modeling on the subject either. To Peter's point about scarcity, I mean, there are like, if you're mining water ice from an asteroid, you decompose the water ice into oxygen, or hydrogen for fuel storage or something, or as propellant. I mean, like there is scarcity in that respect, because presumably, for longer run habitations or ventures, you're going to have to do more in situ cultivation of these things. So I do think scarcity applies, just in part because like of distances and uncertainties. Like, okay, we can do a survey of asteroids in whatever field of space we're interested in, and we can estimate that we know what they're composed of, and so we can plan a mission to a given asteroid to collect this resource or what have you. But there are so many uncertainties in there too. So like, I think it's it's a little. I think scarcity certainly applies, but what's your response to that? I'm curious.
Yeah. I mean, I suppose I should clarify. Like obviously, there's scarcity insofar as like there seem to be a finite amount of atoms in the universe. So like, yeah, but like scarcity modeling on Earth, where like say like I'm in a town and there are like 10 goats. And there are 20 people in the town. And it's like, okay, well, we have to figure out how to distribute the 10 goats among the 20 people. Like that seems to be like a fundamentally different issue than say like, okay, we now have a colony on the moon. We have to produce air for something. And so like there's not there might be an existing baseline that like is already scarce, but we have to I don't know how to phrase this right. Like okay, so yes, there's a scarcity of like of mineable helium, hydrogen, et cetera, and asteroids. But like it's not readily usable right away. We have to turn it into something that is usable. And so I think like the production of oxygen, for example, just through mining asteroids or whatever, means that like if there's scarcity, it would only be an artificial scarcity. We could instead like make it such that there's I screw it. I forget how I was trying to phrase this. It just seems fundamentally different, and I can't articulate it any better than that. I probably can, but that's all I got. I don't know.
I think maybe one dimension to add to this question of scarcity is spatial distribution of resources. In the universe, like there's virtually an inexhaustible supply of probably anything you're looking for. Within the space that you can reach in some reasonable time, like a human lifetime or whatever, then you start getting more. I think that's where you start seeing more scarcity. But I think, yeah, it's not something I know much about, so I don't want to hold forth on it too much. But I do think, like, actually, I'm trying to remember. There's a paper on, like reachable near Earth asteroids, and like you have like S-type asteroids, which are like silicate based. You've got M-type, which are metals. Oh gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm going to stop because now I'm doing the thing, Peter. Because like I can't remember this paper, but if I do, I will put a link in the chat or something.
Yeah, no, I'm
Like, it was whatever it was. It was an assessment of like how many asteroids are reachable that have usable materials within some, like, I think like on the Earth side of the asteroid belt or something like that. And it was an estimation of what that was. And so it gets to some of that scarcity question.
Yeah,
Well,
I think, sorry, Colin, you want to go ahead? I
no,
was going to
carry
say
on.
something on this, that I think NASA did recently a mission where actually they sent a probe to an asteroid, and they said that actually the asteroid, it kind of has this spongy structure. It looks solid, but actually it's not solid. It's kind of like a sponge, so you don't even know if you're going to land on it. And it will only land for like a few seconds, drill, and then come back and bring whatever that debris, and then they can analyze it. That mission was, I think, happened last May, I think. I can look it up but I remember I had the guy that was the head research scientist give a talk, and it's quite fascinating. It's not that easy to actually land on a space object. But if I'm not mistaken, harvesting is happening as we speak. Like, I think such missions are happening.
Yeah, I'm going to say, Yanni, your audio is coming through a little rough there. From what I caught from that, you were talking about current tests into asteroid mining and, trying to determine what resources are available, which I think is a key first step, of course. And we're looking a little more at the future governance of production. Which, to tie back to Peter's question, I think I was hearing Peter kind of asking about the differences in scarcity between actual material scarcity of what is, which is very much a question that's constantly being determined with each asteroid, pursuant to what Yanni was just talking about. But then also, the scarcity based on ownership, and that kind of ties it back to David's points on governance. This isn't just a question of what resources exist and the scarcity caused by that, but the scarcity based on who owns what, and how that's distributed and how we govern that. If I tie all of these pieces together.
The work of integration is never easy.
I think this issue is being currently tackled with the Arctic Circle, which now, because of the ice sheet melting, now there is new land that's been emerged, and actually it's actually a commonwealth in a sense, but actually you have to go and put your stake in. So it's not easy. Theoretically, you can say that, oh, it's shared, it's a commons, but it's only common to the people that actually have the technology to actually reach it. It's very interesting. It's not, but a similar issue is with the Arctic Circle right now.
I see Peter, and there's some points from Roman in the chat as well.
I'm just still trying to find the language to like articulate what I'm thinking, but I think potentially a way to think about it is like space as like the original position, or like the veil of ignorance. Maybe not the veil of ignorance. Forget Rawls, he's boring. But like, but like, I mean, it's true. Rawls is boring. Sorry. But like, okay, so if I'm in the town with like 10 sheep or whatever, like I already have oxygen, I already have the means of survival. I just have to go take the sheep. And so distributing the sheep becomes like a second order problem of like scarcity. Whereas if you have like 20 people shot up in a can to the moon and they plop down, they only have the oxygen that they have with them. And they have to make more. And so they're all in the same position together to start with. They're all in the position of like, oh snap, we got to make more oxygen or we're going to die in 5 days. And in that sense, it seems like discussions of scarcity like take on a very different shape. Like you know, I mean, I don't know. It seems like everyone is then in this position of like, okay, we're screwed if we don't work together. But like this may be too utopian, or taking game theory and thinking like, oh yeah, it's like totally happy and good and stuff. But I don't know.
I mean, I think to your point, Peter, like, you know, the scale question, like what sort of time scale, what sort of you know, scale of like a given population of people, like all these scale considerations do change incentives and the meaning of scarcity, certainly. I mean, I think the activity matters too. If like folks are going to do science versus going for like long-term, again, hate to use the word, but settlement in that respect, or you know, if they're mining, you know, and they're selling stuff to other space actors, that's another thing. I put in the chat, I dropped in the name of the paper I was trying to remember. It might not be the right one, but I think that it might point us in the right way when we're thinking about scarcity, by the way, in asteroids. But I think the use cases matter quite a lot as well. And so we should be clear on what kind of use cases we're imagining for when we're thinking about these questions of scarcity and how things will be shared.
Yeah.
And these points from Roman in the chat were about resource commodity as actual object versus like object of desire, which is an interesting theoretical take on it. So just wanted to highlight that. Yeah, and economies. Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. You were saying?
No, I wanted to catch what you were saying there, David, if that was.
There's always that little Zoom lag too, or no, like we don't know who's speaking. But I'm not sure I follow the comment in the chat there from Roman. Actually, if you're interested, Roman, if you want to elaborate, I'd love to hear it. Otherwise, I'll ponder it some more and maybe drop a response in the chat too.
No, I think we should not go there. We will never get out. And it's not actually about space that much. Okay, it's more about the structure of desire and this type of stuff. Let's not.
Yeah, we moved into some like Freudian Lacan space there. Did you have other points you wanted to draw out, David? I know we've got a chat going on here, but I just don't want to like move us too far away from governance.
So I guess the last thing I might mention is like some of the things that I'm working on next, and if anyone wanted to follow up or keep in touch on those, I just wanted to flag them as things. Starting tomorrow, I guess I could tell you about it now, but a little soft launch. But tomorrow we're starting a group that I'm working on, a Space Governance Collaborative. We're launching a project based on it's an art and community engagement kind of project around what sorts of world we want to see in space. We're calling it the Space Freedoms Project, but much in the way that there was a series of artworks produced by the American artist Norman Rockwell, illustrating 4 freedoms that came from a speech from Franklin Roosevelt in, I think, 1941 or so. Like these 4 freedoms that mark a democratic society, you know, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. Like Roosevelt was making this argument to begin to mobilize the American population to support the Allies in World War II. But Rockwell translated these abstract ideals into a series of artworks that toured the country, raised quite a lot of money, like around $1 billion in today's money for the war effort, but also were like a bit of cultural translation. And so we're starting a project like that for space freedoms and what those look like. And so if you wanted to follow up on that, there's one to flag that. And there's another project that I'm doing, which is a psychology project. We're simulating the overview effect in other space environments in virtual reality, and then putting people in like tests of social cooperation and in-group and out-group favoritism, bias, and so on, some of the things I was starting to allude to earlier. The big idea is that can we start forming a body of research in like that illuminates human nature and cognition in space environments, and use that to inform features of technology design or institution for governance institution design. So there's some work there. I'd mentioned some of the work on competition policy, antitrust. So if anyone has expertise or thoughts in any of those areas, I'd love to hear them. There are a couple of other things besides, but those were 3 quick ones I wanted to flag because they're ongoing right now.
Thank you. And if David, do you have any links for those projects or ways to particularly follow up? I through your Twitter
next
handle
month
and next month. Okay.
We will have websites, we will have Twitter, we will, but
yeah,
not until April. We're launching
so for now,
officially at MIT Space Week, but yeah.
Yeah, David's MIT bio and Twitter handle are in the chat. So if you want to follow up there, and also this talk will be posted on YouTube by NSPDOS. So our information is below for anything for people to follow up. Yeah, thank you. And look out for those links and projects from David. Any final questions
here, I just want to say, oh, I'm sorry.
No, I just was going to say, anything final from you, David, or final questions from folks?
Well, I'll just say thank you to everyone who stayed to the bitter end. I realize it's later for some like Roman than others, but I appreciate it. It was a privilege to share some of these thoughts and progress with you, and I really appreciate some of the back and forth. And I would encourage you to be in touch. I'd love to hear some more about what other folks are working on. You know, it's one of the constraints of this kind of format that, you know, I'm just blathering on it the entire time, but I'd be very keen to hear what you work on and how it relates to some of these questions of space policy and governance too. So please do follow up and just keep in touch because we've been doing this for a while. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great evening. David, you're getting asked a question of your preferred channel of contact. So if you have a way people want to reach out to you, you could also reach us at NSPDOS. We're very open and can, you know, try and facilitate that connection.
Yeah, that'd be awesome. Email works too. I mean, I might take me a while to respond to email, but so don't be shy if you have to bump something up in the inbox. But yeah, just anyway, you reach out, I'll eventually respond, and I look forward to it.
Fantastic, thank you. Everyone, I think,
Well,
David,
oh,
please.
thank you. Oh no, I was just going to say thank you again because I'm grateful.
Fantastic. I think we're going to close it off there, everyone. But have a great evening, and we should have another talk here in about a month. So we're looking forward to seeing you all then.
See you then. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Weston, you still on here?
Yeah, I'm hanging around. How's it? That